We just finished talking about our pre and post zygotic reproductive barriers. These are barriers that are going to limit the ability of populations to interbreed and to produce offspring. So we went through each of the prezygotic types, each of the postzygotic types, and now we're going to move into what we call mechanisms of speciation. So those reproductive barriers are sort of leading to or contributing to this whole big process of speciation. So you can think of those reproductive barriers as sort of a block for interbreeding and helping to push speciation along. But there are a couple of broad ways that organisms are driven into an actual speciation event. Sort of broad mechanisms that continue their separation and keep them from exchanging genes and then also eventually leading to the evolution of new species. So sometimes these mechanisms of speciation get mixed up with the prezygotic and postzygotic barriers. And that's because some of the prezygotic and postzygotic barriers actually fall into the category of one or the other mechanisms of speciation. But keep in mind that speciation is a whole big process and there are lots of contributing factors. And so even though we have these barriers, it doesn't mean it's the only thing going on. And so there might be lots of things that are causing this speciation to happen. So we get speciation by genetic changes in a group that make it different from another. And that can lead to new species. We're going to assume biological species here. So there are two ways by this, how this happens. One is that speciation can occur due to changes that cause this reproductive isolation. So for example, changes in chromosome number, gene incompatibility, things like that. Speciation may also occur as a consequence of adaptations to different ecological niches. So some of our barriers to reproduction might fall into this adaptation to different ecological niches. In the process of allopatric speciation, this speciation happens when members are geographically separated from one another. And I'd imagine that you can think about how this makes sense, and you can imagine that if two groups of organisms are separated and cannot interbreed, well then that makes it easy, right? They're going to diverge, they're going to adapt to their locations, they're going to accumulate genetic changes because they're not interbreeding, they cannot come in contact with each other. So allopatric means different country. The prefix allo means different, patric, like patriotic, means country. So different country speciation. So what this is saying is that these two groups are in two different regions. Now, how far apart that region is depends on the organism. If you're a bird, it's going to take a greater barrier and a greater distance to separate two groups. But if you're something small that's confined to the ground, like say a snake or a squirrel or a plant maybe, you may not be able to interact with organisms who are relatively close to you simply because you can't move if the barrier is big enough. So our example here shows a pond with this little ridge in the middle. And if that water retreats and doesn't come back up, we now have a barrier that keeps these two groups of fish from interbreeding with one another. And so what happens is they change and they diverge and they become genetically distinct and two different populations. So if the water rises after some amount of time, they may not be able to interbreed with one another, even though they come in contact. Another very common example is ground squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon. So that Grand Canyon is far too wide for those little tiny ground squirrels to cross and mate with populations on the other side. So two different populations of ground squirrels on either side of the Grand Canyon have evolved into two different species because they were not able to encounter one another. Another very common example for allopatric speciation is the adaptive radiation of honey creepers. So honey creepers are little tiny birds that eat seeds and nectar. And these honey creepers are related to or originated from Asia, and they migrated to the Hawaiian Islands. And they migrated to one of the islands and then radiated out from that whichever island was first, not necessarily the big one. That's just where my picture put it. So adaptive radiation means that they have spread out radiation and adapted to the particular environments that they encountered. So as they separated, moved to these islands, they were no longer able to interbreed, and all went on their own evolutionary trajectory to be adapted to the specific island environments that they found themselves in. Next, we have Sympatric speciation. Sym means same, so same country speciation. This happens when two groups diverge from one another even though there's no physical barrier. So the image on the right here, Sympatric speciation, shows that that barrier in the center is not so great. These fish can actually cross over, but for some reason they begin to diverge even though they could potentially interbreed. So this is where our prezygotic or postzygotic mechanisms are going to pick up. Maybe they are behaving differently, maybe they're utilizing a different food source, maybe they are a genetic change has caused them to breed at different times. It doesn't really matter for this example here, but the importance is that they have diverged even though they could potentially be exchanging genetic information. There's a little typo on the previous slide, but one common mechanism is polyploidy. So we talked about this already as one of our examples of a post-zygotic mechanism. However, once the poly change occurs, once the change occurs making the genomes incompatible, we then potentially have a pre-zygotic barrier. So once that barrier is breached, once we have these organisms that have produced those different sperm or eggs, we then have a genetic incompatibility. So this might mean that the organism is fertile, the egg is fertilized. It might not. It depends on what the incompatibility is. But either way, you're not going to get a viable offspring between the parents and the new polyploid, and sometimes not even between polyploid and its offspring. But it just kind of depends on the nature of the genetic change. Otherwise, that typo on the previous slide was basically just going to say that this is where within Sympatric speciation your prezygotic barriers are likely to pick up.